do ongoing. I will be giving a brief introduction into the Earth system, its current state, the risks and pressures that it is facing, that we are facing in turn. I'll touch on the global response, where habitat conservation fits into it, and then I'll finish on where WPCV fits into the picture more locally. So the Earth system can be divided into 6 main spheres, starting with the lithosphere, which is particularly interesting because we exploit it, we get a lot from it, everything that powers the world as we know it. So coal, gas and oil, with particular interest on oil, because without oil we can't extract and transport other types of energy at this point in time. Same with ores and minerals. Mining equipment works on diesel and cargo ships as well. Everything in this room needed oil at some point, from the extraction, transportation of raw materials to the fabrication, packaging, delivery of finished products, construction, and in some cases the disposal of waste. So oil is particularly important, and we'll come back to it. We find ores in the lithosphere as well, so I've picked 3 here that are particularly important with the energy transition: lithium, nickel and copper. I want to quickly talk about copper and its mining grade. For those of you who aren't familiar with mining grade, it is essentially the concentration, in this case of copper, within a mine or a deposit. So here we're looking at industrial mines, which are the big ones that supply the world with copper, open cut and underground. The average concentration or mining grade of copper in these mines at the moment is 0.52 to 0.6%, meaning that for every ton of earth in that area, there's about 5,200 grams to 6,000 grams of copper, which is not a lot, especially considering that concentration average has dropped 25% in 10 years. Why? Essentially because as we exploit these resources, all these deposits, there's less and less copper in there, so the concentration goes down, and as we move on to other deposits, they're either less concentrated, smaller and harder to access. So we're seeing that average come down, which means that the size of the mining has to increase, the energy input has to increase, the freshwater input has to increase, the waste increases, and therefore the entire operation increases in price. It gets more and more expensive to extract the same amount of copper. We'll keep that in mind. Lithium mining grades very similar, 0.6 and nickel 0.8. Now the 2 largest reserves of copper and lithium in the world are in Chile, and Chile has a huge water crisis fueled by severe droughts, which is one of the primary reasons that we're projected to have supply shortages of both copper and lithium very, very soon, of up to 50%. Copper is perhaps the most important material in the energy transition, because more electricity means more copper. We don't know how to do it without copper. We'll come back to that as well. The next sphere is the pedosphere, which essentially is the soils. It's very degraded from human activity, fertilizer consumption, deforestation, urbanization. Nutrient cycles are heavily impacted. The hydrosphere is all the water on Earth, from oceans to fresh water. We know oceans are warming, they're acidifying, sea currents are being pushed to tipping points, corals are bleaching, and the freshwater cycles are heavily impacted as well through pollution, fertilizer use, damming of rivers, etc. The cryosphere is all the ice on Earth, from the icebergs, ice sheets, ice shelves, permafrost. We know that parts of it are melting way quicker than anybody can anticipate. The biosphere is everything that's alive, you, me, the animals, the plants. We'll come back to it. And the atmosphere we're all familiar with. It's warming, it's polluted, etc. So all in all, it's a finite system of interrelated elements and processes that has physical stocks, thresholds and boundaries. So in terms of the biosphere, where are we? We've seen a 73% decline of documented animal populations in the past 50 years. That's increased 4% in 2 years. 69% of terrestrial populations, 56% of marine populations, 85% of freshwater populations, and approximately 60% of insects. 60% of forests left are in a degraded state, affecting their functional integrity. A good example of that is the Brazilian Amazon. As you know, the Amazon is the richest biome on Earth, and we can see overwhelming evidence coming out of the Brazilian part of it that it's becoming, it's tipping from a net carbon sink to a carbon emitter, now working against us, perpetuating climate change and engaging in this self-perpetuating negative feedback loop. If that's not enough, we've got about 4.2 to 5 million human deaths per year caused by air pollution. Recent study quantified biomass on Earth, mammal biomass, and states that 96% of all that biomass is actually made up of humans and cattle. 70% of avian biomass is our poultry. 50% of all habitable land on Earth is dedicated to agriculture, and 82% of all that land is used to feed cattle through grazing or growing crops for them. So we've got overwhelming evidence that we are not only causing, through human activity, the degradation of the biosphere, but we're moving very quickly from the Holocene to the Anthropocene. And the Holocene is a set of conditions, the optimal set of conditions that we know from history that can support life as we know it and the world as we know it. So, and the Anthropocene is the epoch in time where humans become the dominating pressure on the Earth system. So this is from a 2015 study conducted by Will Steffen and his team. Will Steffen passed away last year. He was a fantastic Earth system scientist. He worked at the Australian National University of Climate Change Institute. And here they highlight the acceleration, the great acceleration they call it, to the Anthropocene by comparing human activity to Earth system trends with a reference point at 1950. So we can see population growth, GDP growth, foreign investment, urban population, energy use, fertilizer consumption, damming of rivers, water consumption, paper production, transportation, tourism, and we can compare that with the atmospheric content of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, ozone depletion, surface temperature, ocean acidification, terrestrial biosphere degradation down there. And another solid piece of proof that we have of this.
So what's that one? I can't read. Oh, foreign direct investment.
Yeah. Another solid part of evidence that we have of this is the global average temperature change. Keeping in mind that we were last year, we averaged at 1.45 degrees warming. This year we are over 1.5 degrees warming. The difference between today and the big ice age at the height of the Pleistocene 20,000 years ago is 5 degrees difference, global average. So when you hear scientists saying 2.5 degrees, no, we really don't want to know what that's like. We really, really don't. So we see the first uptick at 1880, stabilized during the early 1900s, and by 1950, just goes berserk. And this is well established within science. This is the planetary boundaries framework. Has anybody seen this before? This was developed by Johan Rockström and 28 of the world's best Earth system scientists. Johan Rockström is the director of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. And they essentially, in 2009, first published this. So the study sought to identify the key critical processes that regulate the Earth system. And they came up with 9. And then defined a safe operating zone, which is this circle here, for mankind, based on the Holocene, on the conditions that we saw during the Holocene. And so in doing that, we established thresholds for each of these key critical principles, or boundaries, if you will, meaning that once we move past that threshold, we're increasingly likely to have negative impacts, increasing negative impacts, and self-perpetuating impacts, because all of these silos are interconnected. So we've got climate change that we're all aware of. Novel entities refers to pollution, such as synthetic chemicals, radioactive waste, etc. Thinning of the ozone layer. Atmospheric aerosol loading is airborne pollutants, including but not limited to geoengineering and cloud seeding. Ocean acidification from atmospheric carbon intake, lowering pH levels in the ocean and having consequences on marine biodiversity. Biogeochemical flows refers to the nutrient cycles within the pedosphere, the soils. So we've got nitrogen and phosphorus. Essentially, we've doubled the levels of nitrogen in the soil through fertilizer consumption, and we've leached enormous amounts of phosphorus through mining and fertilizers as well. Freshwater use refers to both flowing fresh water in the rivers, which is the blue water it's called, and rainwater, which is the moisture content in the soils. Land system change measures deforestation, desertification of habitable spaces, urbanization, etc. And biosphere integrity measures biodiversity loss and loss of functional processes from ecosystems. So as you can see, this was the first one that we transgressed in the 1900s. We're well outside safe space. Same with nitrogen cycles and climate change. This was 2009. It was updated in 2015, where we crossed 4 boundaries. As you can see, no quantities and aerosol loading hadn't been quantified just yet. In 2023, this is the state of the Earth system. 6 boundaries crossed, well and truly into the danger zone. Ocean acidification is catching up. Ozone depletion, it depends on where you look. It's being pulled both ways, but generally recovery is ongoing. And aerosol loading is getting quite close to that threshold as well. These are essentially the ecosystems that regulate the climate system. This is from the IPCC modeling. And what's interesting here is that everything that's in red. So everything's in red is at danger of collapse between 1.5 degree warming and 2 degrees warming. So we've got the boreal permafrost, Greenland ice sheet, Barents sea ice, melting quite quickly, especially for the Greenland ice sheet, releasing cold water into the AMOC, the Atlantic overturning heat circulation, which is pushing the tropical rain belt down, causing massive droughts in the Amazon that we're seeing at the moment. It's also trapping hot water and salinity in the southern hemisphere, causing the West Antarctic ice sheet to melt quicker. And over here we have the low latitude coral reefs that are bleaching over and over again, and that support an enormous amount of biodiversity. So what are we doing, really? Decarbonising. Excuse me. Which looks like carbon capture technology, which is at the moment largely inefficient, renewable energy infrastructure, and fossil fuel phase out. So let's have a look. Energy consumption over time. And as we are developing renewables, which are from the orange upwards, we're not quite phasing out anything. As I said, we don't really know how to go about keeping the world going without oil. We're incredibly dependent on oil. Again, this is zooming out a little bit so you can see
Excuse me, Victor, on that previous one,
Yeah.
what's the dip? What's this?
Maybe 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. Probably 2008.
Oh, okay.
Which was a great financial crisis.
Oh, right.
So, 1950, the great acceleration, as you can see, we're just consuming more and more energy. We're not actually phasing out fossil fuels, we're just using more of everything. As I said, we can't create this new technology without the fossil fuels in the first place. And that's a big problem because material use is projected to increase 60% by 2060. It's causing a huge problem because we're depleting our natural resources. As I explained, they're getting harder to extract. We need to put more energy into the extraction, and energy as a whole is getting less available. So you see this cycle. And we're going to have some serious supply shortages. Don't believe me, it's coming, and we're going to have to start answering questions of who gets these resources, where, why, who decides, and we're not even having that conversation, especially up in Parliament where they should be having it. This is all from this year. The International Energy Agency is particularly worried over lithium and copper, as I mentioned. The water crisis in Chile is not just in Chile, it's in many parts of the world, impacting not only the mining industry, livelihoods as a whole, different sectors of the textile industry, the agriculture industry, many different countries. And sand's the second most used resource in the world. It's the main component of the construction industry. We're talking about marine sand, because desert sand can't be used because of the physical properties of the grain. And we're running out of sand essentially really quickly. A lot of it is extracted illegally. There are sand mafias in the world, there are sand wars in the world. And we're projected to run out of this marine sand so quickly that we won't have enough to maintain our existing infrastructure, let alone new infrastructure. And if that wasn't enough, we're projected to have serious oil supply shortages by the end of next year, for the same principle that oil is getting harder and harder to extract. Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the world, that sees production tumble 75% in 14 years because it's unviable economically, partly due to US sanctions. But I mean, the last affordable, cheap reserves of petrol that we have, of oil that we have, are in Iran, Iraq, and Russia. It's going to be a fun few years. So this is a huge problem. I mean, so we've got hurdles ahead with this energy transition, supply shortages, funding shortages, serious social justice impacts when it comes to the distribution of resources, water availability, etc. As I said, dependency on the flow of a reliable flow of cheap oil, because that flow has to be reliable and predictable. And even if we get past all that, it's not really sufficient. It wouldn't be. So we're putting all our eggs in this one basket, this one energy transition. We're going to use up all our resources, and I'm not the one that's going to say it's bad or it's good, but I'm just saying perhaps we need to think it through a little bit more. And the problem isn't where we get our energy from. If we had 100% clean, free energy tomorrow, it wouldn't save us, because the problem is what we do with the energy. And to say it simply, we extract from the natural, process it, consume it, and spit out the waste, and we do that at a rate that exceeds the Earth system's capacity to self-regulate and remain stable. And as a consequence, life on Earth is collapsing. That is the problem. So where does habitat conversation come into that? It has a huge role to play to stop the degradation of the biosphere. As we know, over 55% of global GDP is directly linked to the inputs that we get from nature. Biodiversity underpins ecosystem health, and so we're left in a situation that philosophically I find incredibly interesting because we're a very selfish species. We care about ourselves, and to keep on caring about ourselves, we're going to have to break that programming and put everything else first, because otherwise it's not going to work. Can we do it? I don't know, but it'll be interesting. So current state of conservation efforts, $7 trillion a year is invested into activities with direct negative impact on biodiversity, while only $200 billion is invested into nature-positive solutions. Philanthropically, only 2% of total philanthropic giving goes into the environment, so we've got a huge funding gap to close, and essentially governments and businesses need to put their money where their mouth is. That's my point. So, you guys are all over this, but preserving and boosting biodiversity comes in many different forms. The most important one this time is to reduce human impact, reduce production, consumption. Native forest, river, catchments and ocean conservation is an obvious one. Land use distribution refers to our agricultural sector especially, custodians. So this is more conceptual at the end. We really need to switch from this colonial ownership way of thinking to a custodianship way of thinking. And we need to give up this idea that we're going to innovate our way out of this crisis. We, the colonial West, created this crisis, and we are the most destructive culture that's ever lived. And there's thousands of examples of other cultures that have far more symbiotic relationships with their environment, and perhaps we should look to them instead of trying to innovate our way out of this and solve the problem for everybody. So where do we fit within that? WPCV is a community land trust. We are essentially, to say it simply, this is our vision statement, to say it simply, we're here to look after the high conservation value land just in the Clarence Valley, and we're here to transfer it from private ownership to community ownership, increasing involvement of the community, increasing, or through decision making, through on-ground involvement, education, and increasing that sort of resilience there. So we're a company limited by guarantee, much like Bush Heritage and other land trusts. It's just the standard legal structure for that sort of organisation. We're a non-profit organisation governed by a committee, bound by the Corporations Act, a constitution, and a purpose. And within our constitution, there are safety mechanisms that are embedded to protect our assets, so that, say, when there's a leadership change in 20 years, nobody can turn around and say, hey, we're going to sell that property to a developer. So it's actually embedded in there. We've got other tools to protect our properties as well, but those are the first ones. So as I said, we're really a localized land trust. That's what differentiates us from other land trusts, is that we're localized and we're here to look after our own backyard. So we've got a minimum of 3 directors, which at the moment is Aurore Lindley, Lee Scarlett and myself. We've got an executive committee to assist us overseeing the company's operations, and a stewardship committee which we're building on, and their job is to, they're an expert panel, their job is to assess properties, create management plans, recommend what we call stewards, so subcontractors or community groups to undertake the work, and then reviewing their performance, making sure it's done right and up to best practice. I won't go through all of that, it's just some of the tools around our belt to go about it. But essentially we are an entity meant to be a landowner, so that's how we go about it. There's meant to be a video there, that's not, oh yeah. This will give me a chance to shut up. This is our first project. Kalskog to Coral, you may have very well all heard of this. It's essentially what brought us together in the first place, and it's a great story. I'll put this on and I'll come back.
Volunteers are fundraising to buy land.
Yeah. We don't have sound.
Wildlife Reserve in the Aurore Clarence. The site has been identified as important habitat for threatened species, the black glossy cockatoo.
Glossy black cockatoos are a bit like the koala, feeding exclusively on trees, often in the path of human development.
They only feed on one type of tree, she oaks, or allocation and they don't feed on any species of she oak.
This Galmarid property is a vital habitat remnant.
There's over 70 species of flora, providing for over 60 species of fauna. There's over 30 hollow-bearing trees, some of them bearing up to 7 to 8 hollows. And over 35 cockatoo feed trees.
The local glossy black cockatoo population is just 11, but other threatened species live here too.
The other animals on there, like the rufous betons, powerful owls, the coastal emus.
But the current property owner, Carl Ferguson, needs to sell the land.
I sort of afford to keep yourself financial, whether it is a retirement package if you like.
A lot of glossy black cockatoo habitat has already become coastal housing development.
And the entire Australian population is estimated at about 7,000 birds, and they're liable to go extinct in the medium term unless we can do something about the threats that they're facing.
Wildlife Preservation Clarence Valley wants donations.
We're fundraising to acquire the property to turn it into an open space recreation reserve under conservation management.
The site contains several known feed trees where the birds have been observed feeding, and where you can see the tube cones on the ground of the feed trees, and that makes it really important.
To get involved, search online for Wildlife Preservation Clarence Valley. Claire Simmons, 7 News.
It is a good story. It's a story of compromise and discussion. So when we met, it was like this. You know, he wanted to develop and have his money, and I was like, no, look at the birds. So yeah, it was through having those tough discussions that we got on the same page. And recently, we've agreed on the price, the purchase price, $850,000. Which is a lot of money, but it's also a lot less than you could make on that project. We're still figuring out a couple of the details, but essentially both parties are willing now. We have a price, we have a way forward. The only thing stopping us is the funds. We're working through a strategy to implement next year to have a real go at pulling those funds together. So it's a 9-acre property from 101 to 93. Those blocks here Carl has and have already partially cleared, and he lives on 93. So we're really looking after, or are after 101 to 96, 6 acres of wildlife corridor. Zone R5 subdivision was approved in 2007, so it's a legacy development. 75 species of flora, it's going up 5. We found some species of native orchids, 62 species of fauna, 30 hollow-bearing trees, and yeah, different species that I mentioned. Next slide, please.
You're not meant to
so this is the flora list. We won't go through it. Just so you see that I've done it. But avian bird list. So this is the habitat. Blue circles are the larger habitat trees, bearing for the most part multiple hollows. The reds are the slightly smaller but yet mature habitat trees. And the purple one is the jewel of the block. It's got, well, it had 8 hollows, it's just lost a branch in storm, so I've got to go and count them, but it's just a beautiful tree.
So what species are they?
Well, we've got 13 different species of eucalypts, so there's a few. The one that's in purple is a blackbutt. We've got it's well over 200 years old. We've got a tallow wood, which is probably over 300 years old. It's huge. So we've got many big old-growth trees, pre-colonial trees. Glossy black cockatoo habitat. So all these are trees that are confirmed and seen glossy black cockatoos feeding from. Across a 6-acre property, it's really dense habitat. It's almost unheard of. The blue spot is where they drink, and the yellow spots is where they roost. This is the larger area, so you see there's also feed trees on the Crown land. Funnily enough, out of the 186 hectares, they only have some feed trees in this corner, which is about 3 acres right here. I've walked that block 100 times back to front, and that's the only glossy black cockatoo habitat I found. So a couple, well, another drinking spot there, roosting spot there. Rufous bettong habitat, so we're able to document some rufous bettongs. They're funded by Saving Our Species as well. So you can see that the blue spots are frequent sightings, the red spot is the photo point for these photos. We've got coastal emus going through fairly regularly actually, so they probably come from this this Crown land, and where there's yellow dots, there's a path for them to follow and no fences, so they either come through here and up Willie Wagtail, and they'll loop around Australia Drive, Bruce Drive, and just kind of go back on. They usually hang a few days. We see them
Quite a common size,
yeah, 2-3 times. I mean, we had a dad and his 2 chicks just before the emu count. That's probably the last time we saw them. Photo point for the emus. This was a couple of years ago now, so we've seen them since. So this is the adjoining property for cows. Cows is all the trees in the background, and there's no fence between the two, so they just come and go freely. So yeah, that's our first initiative, and we're all in on this one because it's such a good story. If we can get a success, it would get the ball rolling for WPCV in a really big way, and there's such a lot of potential for WPCV. I mean, we're filling a gap that we identified, trying to essentially complement what's already happening in the Clarence Valley. And you know, we have a land trust across Australia, but the point is to have a localised land trust to just look after the Clarence Valley and act where the BCT or Bush Heritage might not be able to because of criteria and their investment strategy, etc. And to finish up, I'd like to, if you're interested, especially in the first part of the presentation, I'd really recommend going on YouTube and watching this. To be honest, I think everybody should watch it at this point in time. It goes for 2 hours, but it's a lot more in depth than what I've just done, and the second part he really goes into how to boost resilience and talks about things that we can all do ourselves on an individual level, but as well with our businesses or with our local governments. And those are my references for anybody interested.